Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'll give us just a couple of minutes for people to stream in, and then we will get started. All right. So to get us started, just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. So many of you might not be able to attend the full webinar today, or you just want to rewatch what we talk about today, or you might have a colleague who was unable to attend, whatever it may be. Fear not, this webinar will be recorded. So everyone who registered will receive a follow-up email with the recording. That email will also include a certificate of attendance and any other resources that we used or discussed in this email. So don't feel like you need to take notes or screenshots or whatever it may be. You will get access to all of that after the fact. There is also a Q&A box that's open to you. So if you have a question for the organizers or for the panelists, feel free to use that box. I will be keeping an eye on it. If we ask you any prompts, that is also where we will be monitoring your responses. All right, so for those of you who don't know much about Teachstone's mission, we are really about helping every child reach their full potential. And to do that, we do that by observing and measuring the interactions between teacher and child, and then working with teachers, with coaches, with administrators to help them improve on those interactions with their children and with their colleagues when necessary. So far, we fulfilled that mission with educators in all 50 states and around the globe. And we know that we still have a lot of work to do, right? And that's why we're excited to be having conversations like the one we're having today. Our presenters will be sharing research-based strategies to promote equitable teaching so that every child can experience those life-changing teaching interactions. So again, thank you for spending your time with us today. Before I hand us off, I have a few questions for you. Two will be via poll, and then the third will be in the Q&A box. So my first question for you is, what is your role in the organization that you are in? Are you a teacher? Are you the coach, the administrator, or the observer? Let us know what your role is. All right, so I'm getting 70% of the attendees today are teachers. And then we have 16% are coaches and mentors. And then we have a few 7% observers, and then other people said other as well. So welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My second question for you all is, what setting is your program currently in? Let's see. Are you mostly hybrid? Are you 100% remote? Or are you doing it all in person? How is your program operating at the moment? All right, so pretty even split there. Most people are 100% virtual, and then looks like in second place we have people working in person, and then some of you are also teetering between the two, using a hybrid program. Okay, final question, and use the Q&A box for this one. What are your concerns or your area of focus when it comes to promoting equitable classroom interaction? So what role do you play in fostering equity in your capacity? So find that Q&A box, send those responses over to us, and then we're going to get started in just a moment.
I always love hearing what people respond in terms of how much is remote. So we've been doing these webinars now for a while, and we see the sort of trends and shifts. But I was actually a little surprised that we still had 50% remote, although we know we're headed probably back in that direction for lots of the country. So.
I always think it's fascinating too to think about the remote, because it opens up a whole new can of worms when we think about equity.
Maybe we didn't have that as a question, Stephanie, but we may not have to add that one given where people are right
now. So some responses are coming in. Someone said making sure that I get each kid what they need. Someone said their biggest concern is meeting students where they are. Someone said trying to be politically correct. It's an interesting one. Someone said there's a difference in education and experience levels between staff members. That's their number one concern. Struggling to teach remotely and how to do that equitably. That's a good one. So as those responses are coming in, I'm going to go ahead and introduce one of our panelists today, our CEO, the co-founder of CLASS, a leader in the early childhood space, and an all-around rock star, Bridget Hanwery. Thank you for taking the time today to speak with us, and I will hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Gloria, for being the wonderful host that you are. Hi, everyone. I'm incredibly excited about this conversation today. I think all of us know that equity is something that should always be at the forefront of our minds, but the experience of 2020, from the inequitable impacts of COVID to all of the racial unrest, I think has brought a new level of attention to this issue. And there's nothing more important in our world, given that our focus is around this idea of ensuring that every child has access to great teachers. And as Gloria said, we think we've done a lot of work in that space, but we also know that there's a lot more that we can do. And I am incredibly honored to be joined by a colleague who's been focusing on this work for many, many years. We won't say how many years. So Stephanie and I go way back. We were actually in graduate school at the same time at UVA. So we've known each other for a long time, but not that long, right, Stephanie? And one of the things, I could read all of Stephanie's accomplishments. She's currently an associate professor at Boston University, but I'll just actually say one of the reasons I'm excited to have you with me today, Stephanie, is that there's a lot of researchers. There aren't a lot of researchers who have a deep understanding and ability to connect research, policy, and practice. And that is so core to who we are as an organization. And that is really, I've seen you do that in all of your work. And so I'm really interested to have this conversation. And it's great, since we have so many teachers on board. We'll promise, although drawn from research, that this is going to be a really practical conversation. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and talk with. Go ahead.
It is great to have you. So our focus, and actually, Gloria, if we can still go back to the slides just for a minute. So our goal today really is to discuss sort of practical research-based strategies for promoting equitable teaching, so that every child can experience those kinds of interactions. And a lot of this work will draw from an observational tool that Stephanie has been working for several years on, called Access. Stephanie, do you want to just tell us a little bit about the Access tool? I know we'll dive much deeper into it, but just give us a high-level sort of orientation to what that is.
Yeah, so the Access tool is a classroom quality measure that specifically takes on the lens of what the classroom experiences is like for racially marginalized learners. And we thought that it was important to do that and to create a tool that specifically does that, because we know that the experience that racially marginalized children have in the classroom can be different than the majority children in the classroom.
Great. Okay, so we're going to dig much more into that. So if we go to the next slide, I want to just, there are many sort of statistics we could bring to bear in this conversation. So I just put up a few that I think are important for grounding us. One of those is that although Black children account for just 18% of preschool enrollment, we know that almost half of the children suspended more than once are Black. That there's clear evidence of inequity there, and we'll dive in today to understanding why that might be. We also know that although there's strong evidence that Black students do better when they have the experience of having a Black teacher. Here you see some statistics about being 13 more likely to enroll in college. We know that the majority of teachers across the early childhood and K-12 space are white. So that creates another inequity. And then, one of my favorite studies, Walter Gilliam did, because I love video, and this was a study where they used video and they actually tracked teachers watching in classrooms, and they were able to determine that teachers, actually regardless of the teacher's own race, tended to observe Black children, and especially Black boys, more when they were expecting challenging behaviors to occur, even though there weren't actually any challenging behaviors in that particular video that people watched. So I know, Stephanie, you have a lot of thoughts and ideas about even these statistics. Anything that sort of stands out to you, or any other sort of things that ground you from a sort of reality as you think about the work that you've done?
Well, I think that Walter Gilliam's study really is a grounding force too, in terms of the inspiration we had for Access, because in the Access tool, what we are trying to do is actually create a measure that can look at and really capture what we consider to be inequitable discipline. And right now, we actually don't have any of our classroom observations. They don't really do that right now. So we were really moved by sort of these statistics about suspension and expulsion, and Walter Gilliam's study as well.
Great. Well, so actually, let's sort of dive into that specifically. Can you talk a little bit more about why it's important to focus on racial equity in classroom interactions?
Yeah, sure. So one of the reasons, well, there's several reasons, right? And so when I think about this, it's like, why might we want to view classroom quality from the lens of racially marginalized children? And one of the reasons is, like I said before, we know that racially marginalized children experience the classroom differently than the white children. And this is even true when a classroom is very high quality as well. Another reason that I think it's important to think about this is that our research shows that children of color are treated differently, especially when those children are in predominantly white settings, or when those children might have challenging behaviors. And I think that the research about suspension and expulsion speaks to this, as well as the Walter study as well. And then lastly, another big thing that was inspirational for us in terms of thinking about this is thinking about how to enhance RML's achievement by specifically thinking about how to make interactions with them maybe more frequent and more specific. And we say that because that is the very nature of what equity is. So sometimes when people say, like if I'm saying to you, you might need to modify your interactions with RMLs. You need to might make them more frequent. You might need to make them sort of deeper. You might need to try harder to create an emotional connection with them. And some people might say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to treat everyone the same. We can't do that. The nature of what equity means, it means giving each child what they need to succeed. And some children need a little more, some children need a little less, some children need just the right amount. But that's what equity is giving each child what they need.
Yeah, that's that sort of core difference between equity and equal. I want you to come back, and actually, if we go forward, Gloria, to the, I think, 2 slides, so that Stephanie sort of drew this great picture, because I want to ask you just a little bit more. You said something about how there can be these inequities even in the context of quality. So talk to me a little bit about the sort of overlap between the way we think about quality with class and the work that you've done with Access.
Right. So I love to talk about this because I know class well, and it really was one of the other inspirations for thinking about the access tool. And so what I did when I was thinking about the access tool is really thinking about what are the great things about class that we know and how it's changed the field, but what are the ways in which class is sort of overlooking or not recognizing sort of that full experience of the racially marginalized children. And so I started to think about what those aspects were. And one of the key aspects is that what Access does that class does not do is that Access specifically asks raters to look at and watch the racially marginalized child. And most of almost all of what the rater is observing in Access is specifically related to how the teacher is interacting with the racially marginalized child. And that's different. That's very different, because class is really about sort of global quality in terms of, we're looking at sort of the average of how all children are treated in the classroom. But with Access, it's really about the racially marginalized children. And if we get to the video at the end, I can give you a good example of why that's important, why it's important to sort of hone in on the kids specifically. And the way I like to think about it is that you can think about class as being sort of this generic sort of like global view of quality, and Access is really a more specialized view of quality. And I put the little arrow here because I like to think about it as though there's really like a sweet spot of quality for racially marginalized learners. So yes, we need sort of the general high quality, what we know, what the field knows to be high quality. We need a classroom that has those core components of high quality. But then you also need a classroom that is really specifically focusing on the RML children and what they need in terms of equity. And once you do that, that's when you hit that sweet spot of sort of the ideal environment for racially marginalized kids.
Stephanie, can you actually define for us, sort of operationalize racially minoritized children, learners? Because I think that's something we like, you throw that word about, and like for a teacher who's listening, what does that mean to them?
Yeah, so, and this was a hard thing for us to come to in terms of what we would call the children. So we decided as a team to use the term racially marginalized learners, because what we want to emphasize is that the fact that historically there are some groups of children and families who have been marginalized in the education context, right? They were either denied access, or they were segregated, or they were forced to be in sort of low quality, underfunded programs. So they've been marginalized in some way. And what's really important for us to think about and understand from the view of Access is that we know that a good portion of those children have been marginalized because of their race. And so we're really thinking about sort of who are those children who are from groups, racial and ethnic groups that have been marginalized historically within the education community. And those groups are Black and African American children, Latinx children, Asian American children, because again, there's a wide diversity, across our country in terms of the actual ethnicity of our Asian American children. And some of our Asian American children are more marginalized in terms of the education system than others. And of course, our Native American children as well. So that's what I mean.
That's great. And, one of the conversations we've been having a lot recently, both internally in our company, but also in some of these national conversations, is I think sometimes there is a tendency for educators to want to say, but I don't see race. Race isn't important to me. So can you talk to me a little bit just about that construct and how you, as an observer in a classroom, understand and identify race? I don't know if that question makes sense.
Or like, why is it important for teachers to sort of see race?
Yeah.
Well, it's really important for teachers to see race because we know that affects how children are actually treated, right? We know that it affects how they're treated. It's a fact, we have proven this over and over again. And then it also affects the level of support children might need. And what I mean is, think about the context in which we're living. So we have a pandemic that is disproportionately affecting racially marginalized children, right? And we have in our country witnessed repeated police brutality against African Americans. And so what is happening is that everybody is aware of that. But can you imagine being a young child during this context? Even if as a young child, even if you're not actually seeing the videos yourself, you know that something is wrong. Children are very perceptive. They know that adults are more stressed out. They know that adults are whispering about things. They might catch a word here and there. That is very stressful for a child. And to be a teacher, our job is to care for the whole child, not just their academic component. So if you have a child that's coming into your classroom right now under this toxic stress that we're living in, this is a very, very important time for you to be thinking about race, because it is a time in which the children who are racially marginalized actually need more love, more support, more understanding, and their families do as well.
I love that response. And I also just think that sometimes, and I can say this as an educator myself, and particularly as a white woman, right, there's a fear of going into this territory of, if I acknowledge that I see race, I might be acknowledging that I'm treating people differently. And I think why I'm excited to get to this conversation is I think a part of the way we can address fear is to give people information. So I think you have like some really, really practical advice to give to educators about what they can do. But so we're going to get to that in just one more moment, but I have one more question for you, because we often also hear about culturally responsive teaching. Can you talk a little bit about, is this the same as culturally responsive teaching? Is it different? Help us make sense of that.
Right. So I also am someone who researches and studies culturally responsive teaching. And I do think that culturally responsive teaching is incredibly important. And I can say with the Access tool, we actually started out trying to create a tool that would measure culturally responsive practices in the classroom. Unfortunately, that did not pan out, because what happens in our classroom is that the children in our classroom are culturally diverse, right? So even if they're from the same racial group, they can be culturally diverse. And it's also very common that within our schools, there are lots of children across cultures that are educated together. Latinx and Black children are often educated together in a lot of our urban districts. And so to create a measure in which we are supposed to be trying to measure culture per se, it was actually too difficult because of the variation sort of in culture. So what evolved in terms of the tool is that I started to look at and think, well, what is it that all the racially marginalized children have in common, right? So even if their cultural background is different, what is it that they all have in common? And what they have in common is the experience of racial inequity, that experience of their group being marginalized at some point. And so what we do with Access is that Access actually is not a tool that measures culturally responsive practices. It actually is a tool that measures racially equitable teaching practices. And it's just slightly different. Now, even as I say that, it is not as though the Access is devoid of culture, because that's not true at all. It's not devoid of culture, because a lot of that culturally responsive work went into the designing of this, but it is not a measure. At the end of the day, when you use this measure, you won't be able to say how culturally responsive a teacher is, but you will be able to say how equitable she is.
Great. So we're going to dive into that. And I want you just to sort of give us, I mean, one of the things that I appreciate about your work and your focus on measurement, and this, comes from our work around class, is it's one thing to talk about what good teaching is. It's a whole nother thing to operationalize it, to make it really specific, such that you can train other people to see that. And the work that you've done around that, I think, is really transformational here, because it allows us to move from just talking in vague parameters around what teachers to do to some real specifics. So let's just jump back into that. So Gloria, if you want to bring back up the PowerPoint slides, I think Stephanie has a nice slide that sort of highlights the sort of key elements of teaching practices that you've honed in on. So do you want to tell us a little bit about some of those?
So you might be wondering sort of what is equity focused quality look like? What is it? What does that lens sort of look like? And so we have thought about 6 dimensions, and one is what we call the challenging status quo knowledge. That first dimension is something that it actually looks at whether the teacher is intentionally challenging dominant male-oriented, Eurocentric knowledge, history, knowledge, and the social hierarchy in their classroom. So it is it's looking at whether or not the teacher is using classroom tools or engaging children in conversations and activity that sort of disrupt the status quo, that offer what they call in critical race theory a counter narrative of history and of who people are. And so it's really an idea, it's really a look at how the teacher is engaging children around the content that they're learning to help them think about issues related to social justice. And then the next thing, the next aspect is we have equitable learning opportunities. And this, oh, go ahead.
Interrupt. I have a question. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So this question, I think, maybe goes back to the culturally responsive question, and it comes from a teaching experience I had back when I was a first grade teacher. And it was one of those moments when I think I, as a white teacher, just was unclear about what to do. So I want to sort of bring myself back to that space and ask for advice. So the simple version of the story is there was a biracial girl in my classroom. Her mother was Black, her dad was white. We had crayons that reflected sort of every skin type in the classroom. Her best friends were 2 white girls. One of the white girls drew a picture of the 3 of them and chose a skin color for Santilia that was much darker than her actual skin color. And it was very upsetting to her. And she sort of came to me in that moment in tears, upset, not even really able to articulate why she was upset. And so there's that moment, right? And I think there's a moment of just leaning in and making her feel better, but I'm wondering if there's also a moment of sort of challenging the status quo, that I had an opportunity, a sort of missed opportunity there. So I don't know, does that fit?
Yeah, so I definitely think that is true. I mean, one thing that's great is that you're saying you had crayons that were the span of all colors. That's great. That's a material and a tool that's important. But in that instance, what could have happened is a conversation. What was her name again? What was the child? Cecilia. You could have had a conversation with Cecilia to sort of ask her, well, why do you feel upset? Right? And sort of really see what it was that was making her upset, because she could have been upset because she felt like that was making her an outsider. Right? So there's 3 friends and she's now an outsider because her picture looks different, and children do not want to be outsiders, right? It could have felt different. It could have been upsetting to her because maybe she does not, maybe she didn't think that color made her character look as pretty, right? And that's another conversation sort of to have, with her. And to be able to talk about sort of why she might have felt, that way. And I think that the other conversation, a third way to actually think about that conversation, and maybe to wrap it up, is to ask her, which color do you think represents you? Right? Because that gets, again, at her identity. How do you see yourself? How do you want to be represented? Right? And have that conversation with her. And then as a teacher, what you can do is foster a conversation among the group of girls to be able to help them understand, this is how Cecilia feels. Like, help her explain to her friends, this is my identity. This is how I see myself. This is how I want to be sort of represented. And then, and also bring the other girls in too, to understand their point of view of why did they use a different color crayon? What do they think about it? Et cetera. So that is a perfect example of the type of kind of high level conversation that we would want to see in terms of challenging status quo knowledge.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so I interrupted you though. So now go and tell us a little bit more about equitable learning opportunities.
Yeah, so with equitable learning opportunities, we should have like 4 RMLs. I should have typed that in there because this is one of the specific dimensions that actually look at how the teacher is directly treating RMLs. So for all of these items that someone would be observing on, they're all related to sort of how often the teacher is asking the RML children questions, how much she's making eye contact with them specifically, how much scaffolding she's doing with them specifically. So this is, again, very much the heart of the measure because it really hones in on what is that learning environment like for the RMLs specifically. And then inequitable discipline, that's the dimension that I told you about before, where it really tries to look at, first we look at sort of what is the disciplinary climate of the classroom in general. You know, is it too rigid? You know, is it developmentally inappropriate, sort of in general? And then the rest of that dimension asks you to look specifically again at how the teacher is treating the RML children in the classroom. Sort of, are they being sort of pushed away, told to leave the circle? Are they being sort of like, you know, overly policed, overly controlled in terms of how they move their body and what materials they use, etc. And then we have, okay.
I have a question here for you because I think one of the questions that we often get in terms of class is, you know, is it possible to define what quality looks like for different cultures? So, and a lot of those questions are actually often about discipline. And so sometimes I have been asked the question, you know, shouldn't Black children be disciplined in a different way than white children, and how do we account for that? So I'm curious about how you thought about this when you were talking about sort of developmentally appropriate practice and discipline. How do you think about that from this sort of equitable stance?
Right. So when I thought about this, I thought about discipline in the classroom specifically and discipline from a teacher. And so it is my interpretation as a Black scholar, as a Black mother, as someone who fully culturally a Black person, is that I understand what the literature says and what we even say among our community about sort of discipline and disciplinary practices that we might have that are different. I understand that. But we're talking about in a home context and in a community context, right? And I think that I feel comfortable, like I said, as a personal scholar, I feel comfortable with having that variation exist within our communities and within our homes. In the school setting, which is a professional setting, which is regulated by laws and professional standards of ethics, I think that children should be disciplined in an equal or equal manner, right? They should be disciplined in the same way. So I, as a professional, do not feel at all that within the classroom context that there are some racial and ethnic groups of children who should be disciplined in different ways because of their racial and ethnic background. I believe that when you are a teacher in that space, you are a professional, and our professional ethics dictate that we treat children in terms of, you know, in terms of discipline, that we do not show differential treatment in terms of discipline. That is our professional ethic. And so I think within the context of schools and classrooms, I do not think it should be different.
Well, and I think it goes back to the Walter Gilliam piece, right, and some of this other data, which is to say, we know that there are great inequities, right? So you're sort of calling out about, am I asking more questions of certain kids than others, or am I looking for problems for certain kids? Right? Like, we know those things are happening. So your focus is really on creating more sort of equity there in terms of, and just awareness, I imagine, for teachers in how they may be treating different children differently. So
right. And because they're treating them differently, I guess I should say, for the bad, you know, part. And so, and it gives a way to measure it, right? Like you said, to quantify sort of how they're doing it differently.
Right. Okay. So sorry for the interruptions, but it's helping me understand. So
and
tell us a little about connections to home life.
So for connections to home life, this is one in which it's sort of the general thing that we think of when we do connections to home life, about sort of thinking about the stories that people are telling, the stories that children bring into the classroom about their home life, the stories that teachers bring into the classroom about their home life. Now, one thing that is specific that we actually learned through the first iteration of our measure is that, again, this needs to be connections to home life specifically for racially marginalized children, because what we found in our first study, when we were trying to look at sort of child outcomes, is that there were some white teachers and some teachers of color and some diverse children, some ethnically and racially diverse children in the classrooms in the study, and some white children. So what we found is that there was that what we think was happening is that the white teachers were getting high scores on connections to home life, but they're getting high scores because they're talking with white children about their home life. They're not having the same level of conversations with the Black children. And so what we really specifically had to do again was say, nope, let's focus on sort of these connections that she's making with the racially marginalized children. And then personalized learning opportunities. This is the aspect of access that I would say is sort of our general high quality measure. And it really looks at the typical things that we see in high quality classrooms, like the back and forth exchange, using collective discipline, making sure that each child is scaffolded to their abilities. And then the last part is RML's participation and engagement. And this is a dimension that actually looks at children's behavior in the classroom specifically. And so all of the other things up to this point, we're really talking about the teacher, only talking about the teacher's behavior. And then with this piece, we actually pulled out to look at children specifically, and it looks at sort of the emotional state of the child, the interactions with their peers, how engaged they are, etc.
That's great. So for those of you listening, which I imagine many of you are familiar with class, Stephanie and I have been having this conversation actually a lot lately about what is that overlap? What's the connection? So I'm going to say something that I think is true, Stephanie, but then you correct me if I'm wrong. You've drawn in your access tool, you've drawn attention to some things that aren't in class at all. But in some cases, they are things that are represented in class, but you're really sort of asking observers to pay very explicit attention to the way in which they're potentially differentially treating children. So we could think of something like positive climate and relationships, right? The very first sort of indicator out of the gate. And so what you're pushing us to do is not just say, in general, on average, are children experiencing positive relationships? Is the teacher in close physical proximity? But you're asking very specifically, are there differences in the ways in which teachers are doing that for different race children in their classroom? Is that correct?
I think that that's an important thing to think about and to take into consideration. We'll go down a whole can of worms because it's a longer conversation we need to do in terms of whether or not that can actually be done in the way in which class is measured and operationalized now, right? Because I think I told you before, the reason why access exists now is because what I wanted to do, what I wanted to think of, it really couldn't be done, or I couldn't figure out a way to do that within the class kind of framework. But yeah.
But it makes me think of all the teachers. I think I was just talking to a teacher friend of mine about actually teaching in a virtual setting. So maybe we'll just spend a minute there. And that he was actually thinking like it was a rich moment to pay attention to this in his own classroom in a way that he probably hadn't. So this idea of being able to just sort of rewatch yourself teaching and sort of just count, like how often am I asking questions of different children? How often am I responding? So maybe talk just a little bit about what teachers can do to help create greater visibility into their own sort of practice in this space. Yeah, of course they can sort of be observed using the access tool and get feedback, and we can talk about that, but what are some practical things they could do just today?
Well, I think that when we talk about this is a bigger question, because I think that in order for teachers to really sort of gain that introspective lens into themselves, we have to sort of facilitate the development in that area through professional development. So right now, we don't have a lot of professional development around sort of getting teachers to think about their own racial identity, their racial biases, et cetera. We need to sort of infuse our professional development networks with that kind of work, with those kind of opportunities. And as we do that, teachers will then become more self-aware, and then they will then be able to say, now that I'm self-aware, that now that I've admitted to myself that I actually do this, right? That I actually have these biases, how can I then go about understanding when I use these biases, when these biases occur in my daily life, and then control it? Because what people have to learn, a lot of this stuff with implicit bias, it's how our brains have been wired. And so we have to relearn a whole way of sort of interacting. And the learning has become so implicit that we don't even know we're doing it. So our first task is to help people just see what we have learned so far, what they have learned so far, and how that what they've learned is wrong, right? So then we can think about, how do we relearn now what is right?
I imagine that's also in some of your professional development work, also just important to create a sort of safe container for, I imagine this is very emotional content for people to walk into, am I going to be called a racist? And just the fear of doing, well-intended, but doing the wrong thing. I don't know, is that true? How do you negotiate that in supporting teachers in this work?
I think we do it by, like you said, creating safe spaces for teachers to do this work. I think we do it by making the learning objectives clear, like making the learning objective clear in terms of, like, you will be talking about these things, you will feel maybe challenged, et cetera, but we want you to persevere, and we're creating a safe space for you to persevere. So I think that it's the way in which we set up our professional development systems. And in these contexts with this topic, we might need to tweak sort of what we do in terms of PD a little bit more for this topic than what we do if we were just offering PD around literacy, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have more to talk about, but I want to spend a little bit of time watching video, because that's something we do a lot around Teachstone. And so we've picked just a couple of videos. They're very short. I'm gonna have us play this first one, and then when we get to the end, Stephanie, I just want you to sort of say what you see happening that's important.
Okay.
Gloria, we can't hear it.
And which ones are you gonna be? Maybe the bear and Goldilocks, so we can do the story? We'll do it together? Okay, here you go. You're gonna use this one? Okay. Let's, hold on. Let's hang these puppets back up, right? You've got your two puppets, Riley. Come sit right over here. Oh, come sit right here. It'll be okay. You don't want to do it? Okay. Well, I can do it with Jada. Jada and I can do it together then. Okay. Can I use the bears? Thanks. Here, you need a mama bear. Okay. We're doing the story of the three little bears. Yep. Goldilocks and the three bears.
Mama, Daddy, and the baby.
And the baby, yeah.
And the golden.
So what happened in our story? How did the story start out?
Right. So this was a great video to pick, and but I had hard time coding it. So what I did is I went through and I coded it as though I was coding it for Access. So I had a hard time coding it, because there are some aspects of this little clip that are good, like, for example, the teacher, basically what she does is what I call elevating the status of the RML child. Because when the white child decided, no, I don't want to play whatever game it was that they had originally thought they were going to play, the teacher then says, okay, well then I'll play with Jada, right? And so for the teacher to come in and say, well, I'll play with this, with this child, she's actually elevating the status of that child. She's actually showing that, no, this child is worthy of playing with. She's worthy of having a conversation. And I, as the teacher who has like power and authority, I am going to spend my time, engaging with her. So that was great. That was great to see. However, the thing that was difficult for me is that when we think about sort of equity, it has all of these different components that I told you all about. And so, so there were other components about equity as we define it with access that were not evident here. So for example, the whole idea of challenging status quo knowledge didn't exist in this video. If anything, it was counter to challenging the status quo knowledge, because they were using, they're going to recreate a story that is basically all based around a blonde white girl who goes into the bear's house, steals things, uses all of their stuff, and completely gets away with it. You never thought of the story that way, right? But that's what it is.
It's like one of the biggest retellings of fairy tales that I'm not sure it's written out quite that way. Maybe they have.
Right, but that's exactly what it does, is it basically perpetuates a narrative that Goldilocks, who's this beautiful blonde character, can come into spaces where she doesn't belong, use things that whatever she wants, and then and if she gets caught, she just gets to run off, and we never see the consequence for her doing that. So that is not challenging the status quo knowledge at all. Right?
What would be something that a teacher could have done? And maybe it's like they just need a different story, or and maybe that's the point there. I don't know. Teachers always want to know, okay, but what should I do?
So what the teacher could have said is, they could have said, well, we know the story, like we know the story and how it typically happens. What could have happened differently? Or she could have said, what would have happened if Goldilocks actually got in trouble? What if the bears had called the police on Goldilocks? And what might have happened, in that situation? And the idea too of, do you think Goldilocks was wrong? Do you think she was guilty? Do you think that she had a right to go into their house? How do you think the bears felt when she came into their house? Like, there's a whole conversation that can be had around that narrative that is counter to the way we tell that story. And those are the kind of conversations that we really want to see happening in the classroom. The other thing that was like a little bit disappointing with this too is that the teacher does talk to the racially marginalized child, and she is asking questions, but if you listen to the teacher's questions in that video, she's asking a lot of like yes or no questions, and she's really not even giving the children time to answer, right? And so so what I really like to see, especially when we're thinking about equitable learning opportunities, we like to see those how and why questions. And we want them to be real questions that the teacher waits for children to generate an answer sort of about. So that was one thing. And then, of course, the discipline was fine. There was no problems with discipline. They didn't talk about home life at all. And then just to come back to the personalized learning opportunities, again, that is the place in Access where we talk about sort of, is the teacher really engaging in a back and forth exchange with these open-ended questions and really waiting for a genuine answer? And that's where I was saying she didn't quite do that, right? She didn't quite do that.
One of the things I want to say here, just and I always have this challenge when we're sort of dissecting video, right, is that we know we're watching just a short snippet of any teacher's classroom, and it may or may not reflect sort of general trends of what you see. And in some ways, it really is just illustrative. And so I always want to say that, just because we know all teachers are working hard every day to do this work. And so it's hard to show video that isn't always 100% positive, but we also know it can be really powerful. And I say that as a setup to this next video that we're going to watch. And I almost like the next video, and if you can pause it, Gloria, just and not quite start yet, but this next video for me, I'll speak for myself, was very upsetting for a variety of reasons. So I just want to give a warning to folks who, if watching video of very inequitable teaching can be hard, like maybe you want to sign off for a minute and come back. I think it's illustrative, but I do want to also say we have chosen a very short video to highlight an element of this classroom to highlight a specific moment that we know. I don't want to take away, we know this kind of thing happens all the time, but it isn't sort of calling out these particular teachers or,
Right.
I want to just set up that video. That's a lot. Let's now watch it. Again, it's just short, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Again, this is an infant classroom.
Okay.
Everyone is helping a little bit. For the majority, he's being finished. 350. Sandri. Sarah, we'll be back in a minute. She gave you word. I'm getting hungry. You don't hold on to my leg.
So, Stephanie, I know so far your work on access is focused on preschool children, but take me for a moment. What is your thinking as you watch this?
So I think that this video is a blatant example of inequality in the classroom. This clip that we saw is a blatant example of inequality in the classroom. And I would even go on to say that that this teacher is actually violating the Early Childhood NAEYC ethical code of conduct, in which we are supposed to do no harm. So I believe she is actually doing harm in the sense that that is blatant neglect. That is neglect of a child. And we know from a lot of the research that when you neglect an infant, it has ramifications for their brain development. And so I just think that, like I said, it is unethical. I feel it is unethical in terms of what she's doing. And what I'll say too, just to quickly contrast the two teachers. So the first teacher that we saw, I told you I had a hard time coding that video because it was just a clip, and the teacher did do something that was really good. You could see that she was being intentional, that she is thinking about how the Black girl is seen and treated among her peers, and she's willing to vouch for her. So that teacher is when we think about the level of readiness in terms of PD around sort of racial equity, that teacher in the first video she's ready. She's ready to go deeper. She's ready to see and to get the materials and to really think about herself in a deep reflective way, and also to think about things that she could do better. I bet you if we were to explain the Goldilocks story to her the way I explained it to you, she would have a light bulb moment too and say, I never thought about it like that. And she would be willing to change. That is my gut reaction to the first teacher. The second teacher, this is somebody where I think we would have to work harder. I am not sure, well, I know that teacher is not at the same level of readiness, because what we have to understand is that neglect was blatant. So she was actively not engaging the child. She was actively walking away from the child, and she was doing these things even though there was an opportunity for her to interact with him.
Yeah, so Stephanie, just and then I know we're sort of going to have to come to a close, but take me a little bit into that, because I know infant teachers, I have twins, so I haven't lived quite that, but I know taking care of multiple babies simultaneously, it's hard. But what might she have done in that moment while she's trying to attend to the needs of multiple babies, that would have been a better enactment of equitable teaching in that moment.
Great, great. So eye contact, number one, because there were so many opportunities, missed opportunities for eye contact. Eye contact. Every time the child gestured, what we call, from back in the day, the attachment behavior, every time that child elicited an attachment behavior, which is reaching for her and following her, the teacher could have acknowledged that through eye contact and through a verbal response, right? And also through touch. So the teacher could have very well bent down and touched the other child. She could have sat on the floor. Instead of going across the room to sit in the rocking chair, she could have sat on the floor so that he would be able to be near her while she's holding the other child. So I would say eye contact, verbal acknowledgments and response, and proximity, creating opportunities for proximity were the two big things that she could have done differently there.
Yeah. And, I think, again, from my class lens, this is those same behaviors are many of the things that would be captured, but you're really drawing attention to the racial elements of this in a classroom is something that's just incredibly important. So, and I think actually, go ahead, Stephanie.
Oh, I was going to say, because this is the thing, this is where it becomes like sticky. If you were just coding it for class, the place where that is sticky is that the way the two teachers engaged with the white children, that was good. That was loving. They were making eye contact. They were getting kisses, etc. And so if you are looking at it in terms of the class and everything that's going on in the classroom environment, you have to take into consideration these other things. With the access measure, you don't. With the access measure, you can go in and say what is happening with the children of color.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I know, and I'm sorry, we're not going to get to questions, but if there are questions, maybe Stephanie, you and I can look at those and make sure we get back to the community about them. I want you to tell me about your book, which has like the perfect name for exactly what we were just talking about. So, and lots of great practical information for teachers and coaches and others listening who want to know more.
Yeah. So our book is called Don't Look Away. It is, I commonly work with Ioma and Tanya Durden. We work together all the time. We write books and things like that together all the time. This is one of our my favorite books, that we wrote together. And it is the book that I think most educators, all educators need to sort of start that process, to start that awakening in their mind of like the aha, oh, moment. And so I think that I'm just so excited about it. And I think that it has the opportunity to really change our field because we can build our professional development systems around a tool such as this. And as we're talking, we talk about access a little bit in the book, but as we were thinking about it and developing it, I'm constantly thinking about an access framework. So, my next step in life is what I want to do is actually think about how to use the tool Don't Look Away, coupled with sort of these access dimensions, like what would a PD around that sort of like really look like? But it is so, it's one of my proudest achievements, and most people actually love it. Like most people actually really, really love it. It's better than.
I loved it. I read it. It's a great book. I hear it's flying off the shelves, and I know we need to end, but we're going to have one more fly off the shelf today, I think. So I just want to say deep gratitude. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining me. This is just the beginning of conversations that I'm excited to have with you and with our community. So deeply appreciate.
Are you going to announce the winner? What about the winner?
I'm going to turn it back over to Gloria to sort of close us out today.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. So we are giving away a copy of the book today.
Like the Oprah.
Go ahead, Bridget.
It's almost like an Oprah moment, except it's not because we only have one, so I shouldn't have even said that.
Yes, one book today to one of our live attendees. I chose one of you at random, so drum roll, please. Patricia Brown, you are our lucky winner today. I have your email address, so I will reach out to you directly to get your shipping address, and we will get that to you. Congratulations. But before we go, I had a bunch of slides about a bunch of things that I was going to talk to you guys about today, but we do not have time. So very quickly, I know that there wasn't time for all of the conversations that we wanted to have. You guys sent really, really good questions into the chat today. And Bridget, as you said, Liz and I will make sure to get some of those questions to you, because I do think they deserve a little bit more time to talk about. But in the email that I send to you all tomorrow, there will be a recording of the webinar, along with a bunch of free downloads, free resources, free access to our video exemplar resources, such as the 2 that you saw today. And then access to a free webinar series that we have around trauma-informed care and how to help children navigate a lot of the trauma that they might be experiencing now and otherwise. But with that, thank you to Bridget. Thank you to, whoops. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
Apologies for that. Thank you to Bridget. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for joining us today. And we will see you next time.
Great. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.
Okay. Thank you for having me.